Yeah.
You get that?
No, go ahead.
Got that? Okay,
Okay.
so we actually would have time for a 3-minute break, but we'll just keep rolling here. Next up is Credential Database, MCIS Job Board and ETPL. And Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I want to put an issue to the SWIB where we very much want some input from industry and all of our workforce partners. There are a number of systems that exist right now that, in all honesty, are not perhaps as sophisticated or as integrated as any of us would like. And so we want to kind of talk through some of that and get some input. So I want to make sure that folks are aware of what exists, and I'm going to rely heavily on Crystal to interrupt and share her perspectives as often as she needs to. If folks don't know Crystal, she is the interim Workforce Services Division Administrator at DLI. These systems are all that I'm going to talk about today are predominantly DLI systems, but they really need to be workforce systems. And that's part of what we kind of need SWIB's guidance on, is how we pivot that, how we make these inclusive and useful tools, not just for WIOA participants, people who are facing barriers to work, but really for the workforce system as a whole. So can we be more sophisticated? Can we be more innovative? Can we be more inclusive in how we approach some of the various tools that we put out there? And it really ties into the conversations we had this morning. You can see some of the things that are out there in terms of discovery education, bringing career awareness tools, the micro-credentialing and how we would share that and communicate that and replicate that around the state. We need some delivery systems that are a little bit more cutting edge. And so I want to talk about what exists now and get your feedback as to potentially where we could go. This is a real-time conversation. Commissioner Swanson anticipates issuing some RFPs to redo these systems this year. So these are things that this is not an academic conversation. This is a very real conversation that I want to invite your input into. So there are a number of systems for career information, not just for students, but for adults as well, that exist currently. One of those that some of you may be familiar with is the Montana Career Lab. So we know OPI has tools for career awareness in K-12. Certainly the university system has them. DLI has them as well. This system, I think, is interesting. I think it's generally, Crystal, not been updated since 2021. A few additions, but
some small additions,
yeah,
but not a ton.
So you'll see here, there is the login to the Montana Career Information System. That is a basic career awareness tool. Kids, adults can log on, they can learn about careers, they can do career assessments, maybe to get some indication of what the aptitude is. I will share, some of you are very familiar with it, some of you never have gone into it. It's a little dated, to be quite honest. Some of the career assessment tools could be a little more sophisticated. I hopped on and did a career assessment, and one of the questions, and I am in no way exaggerating this, is, do you believe you'd enjoy a career where you moved people's luggage to their hotel room? Well, just ask me if I want to be a bellhop. Like that's not in teaching me anything about what I might want to be. They're questions that don't necessarily guide us if we're already lost into careers. So there is the MCIS tool. And the question is, could we do a more sophisticated career awareness, career exploration tool? Again, not just for the K-12 system, but for out of school youth, for adults, for people transitioning careers. We want to look at a workforce system. So the Career Lab is one thing that exists now. You could see the website there. You could go to it anytime and explore. We also have a job board. So this job board, people can use it to search for a job. The employers can use it to post a job. This is at montanaworks.gov. If you click on the search for a job link, it will take you to the National Labor Exchange, the career one-stop site. This is sponsored by the Department of Labor. You could search locally, you could search nationally. Crystal, anything you want to add on the job board?
We're losing it June 30th.
Okay, so when I say these are real-time conversations, these are real-time conversations.
Can I ask why?
The server, the system that it was built on is no longer supported. It's so old, we don't even have folks who can support it.
Yeah. So the job board is a tool that exists.
That's where we provide feedback, or you want to run through?
I'm going to run through it and then we're going to just generally do feedback. So we also have an eligible training provider list. This is a list of people who have met some applications to be on a provider list to be eligible for WIOA funds. SWIB actually sets the policy for how people get onto the ETPL. Every state has to do this. It's a requirement of WIOA. Ours has grown a little more than it has maybe narrowed. So the ETPL commitment is some data sharing as well, right? So they'll be on the ETPL list. We can refer them. Our career coaches can refer people into the training, and then in return, they will give us some data that helps us with our WIOA compliant reporting. Yeah. Anything else you want to add about that?
No, I don't think so.
It's really pretty wild at this point. We have not, I think, in a very long time, culled people off of it.
Yeah.
So it is a very long list. You can see right here, the general ways to search it are by school or degree. This is what exists right now. This is the requirement. We must have an ETPL list. And as we start talking about micro-credentials and all those sorts of other things, how we handle this list, how we help people understand who's still an active training provider, what kind of data they're giving back into the system. Those are the kind of questions that belong here at SWIB, because ultimately SWIB sets the policy for how people are on this list.
One addition, Jennifer.
Yeah, please.
A lot of states do their ETPL very differently. So the way that we're doing it right now does not necessarily have to be the way that we continue to do it. We need to make it work for Montana's needs.
You just complete how we do it right now.
How we do it right now is if you meet the very broad, our federal criteria, you can apply and be accepted. So we don't do anything in terms of narrowing based on demand. Occupational demand. We don't do anything to narrow based on performance. We don't do anything, we don't have mechanisms around it necessarily to control who is or isn't on the list. As long as you check all the boxes, you can be on there.
And do we make them re-up?
We do. We have not done that previously, I think to the degree that we needed to, but last year we started doing an annual update process.
So, and then the next thing that is emerging, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but there is legislation moving right now called the STARS Act. It is largely about teacher incentive, quality pay, CTE programming. But then it also directs the Department of Labor to do an annual rulemaking to establish a list of industry recognized credentials, combination credentials, work-based learning, and then assign a credit value to each. So you might have heard this be referenced a couple of times this morning when people talk about kids taking CTE credits and the schools getting money. This is a retroactive look. So kids take these various courses, they do the credential, they do a work-based learning, that gets a credit value. And then the next year, the school gets funding based on how many kids did that. And in the bill, there are levels and tiers, all the way from, CTE classes up to graduating with an associate's degree. And so then DLI would do an annual rulemaking to put programs on here. This is not uncommon. There are lots of states who do this, and there are, same with the ETPL, many, many ways for states to do this. There are states who quite literally do this by an Excel spreadsheet. Whoever is in charge of the database just puts out an Excel spreadsheet, says these are the programs that have been certified. There are states that do this in a very sophisticated way, and they integrate them with some of the systems that I already talked about. They integrate them with their ETPL, with their job board, with their career exploration tools, and create a unified tool. And so this is brand new legislation moving forward, and we have an opportunity to weigh in early and give the Department of Labor some input from all of our workforce partners as to how this should look. What is the biggest value add for the state of Montana? Joe, do you want to add anything about STARS Act?
No, I think two things that I maybe would add is, so put on to OG is also talking about what are the college credentials, including AP, IB. So this is thinking about, again, these interesting areas where it can be a combination of college credit, industry credentials, work-based learning. But part of what I think is valuable about it also is saying, okay, this is something where there's real estate dollars directed to schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the thought about what's valuable about those credentials.
Correct.
Are we assessing and measuring, are those valuable credentials? Because You don't necessarily want to send a bunch of kids down pathways with real estate dollars that don't pay off.
That's right. And that's the conversation that we're going to have next here in the metric session. So as you know, as Joe indicated, the STARS Act is directed really at K-12 and the CTE programs and how we do school funding, because it's a school funding bill. But there is the opportunity to think about a credential database, a credential registry that applies to all workforce sectors, that is K-12, out-of-school youth, adults, really giving the private sector some indication that these are the credentials that really matter to industry. These are the credentials on our eligible training provider list that are meeting performance expectations. These are the ones that are aligned with labor market data saying that they are in demand, that they're, these are the wages. We can build something that's much more robust here. The minimum requirement is that we do an annual rulemaking for K-12. The question to SWIB is, what's the maximum desired product? What's the best practice that you all want to see for the state's workforce system? And so an example of that. So the question then becomes, what if we start to pull all these together? We could absolutely do what we have right now, refresh each one of these consistent with what the legislature is expecting, and what new vendors can provide. We could do a better job board. We can clean up our ETPL. We can put out in conjunction with OPI, better career awareness tools. We can issue a very simplistic credential database. That is all doable. But what if we brought it together into one tool? What if we brought it together into a single tool where a student in middle school or high school, where a 18-year-old who has left school, maybe even without a high school degree, where an adult who doesn't want to work in the restaurant industry anymore and wants a career, they can come in and search by occupation and find out all of these things. What are the jobs that are available right now? What does labor market tell me about the projection in this industry over time? What's a day in the life look like? Let's get some of those discovery education videos and show people what it looks like for a Montanan to work this job. Let's tell them who the high quality providers are for the credentials that get them into these pathways. What if it were a singular tool instead of a series of isolated websites? There are states who've done this. An example, I think I put this in your prep memo, is the state of Indiana. They have put out what's called the Indiana Career Explorer. They have done this in conjunction with a national nonprofit called Credential Engine. Accelerate Montana has begun some work with them. But this is an example of what it could look like. So you can see here on their landing page, you sort of pick your entry door, adult, young adult, K-12. You could see across the top that different users can engage with it. There are career exploration tools like assessments, all those sorts of things. You can create your own account where you're tracking the occupations of interest over time. So this is what it looks like on the landing page. And then we're just going to explore it very lightly to give you a sense of what it looks like when all these tools integrate. So let's say I decide to be a K-12 person, and I'm going to scroll down here. I could search by career, industry, or school. I'm going to search to be a welder. Okay. And it's going to show me here all the careers under welder, all the different titles. And you can see Indiana said welding's actually a top career. We really care about this one. So I'm going to click. It's going to describe the sector to me a little bit, and I can learn more. It will tell me what the environment is I work in, what other titles are, so I can search by other titles. And then as I scroll down, I start to learn more about the sector. I can learn what it looks like in Indiana. I can reach over to a job service coach who can help guide me through this process. I see what the salary over career looks like, that career pipeline over time based on labor market information that is provided by the state of Indiana. We can see what the projection is over the course of this in the state of Indiana, how many they expect to be in demand, and we see a career roadmap. How do I grow over time? And then here is their version of a credential database and an ETPL. So these two things have come together, and this is all of the programs where you could go into the welding sector. Now, if you were to play on this website yourself, you could click on View Program, and all of that data that Crystal mentioned is available there. So they will tell you if this provider is meeting expectations. They will tell you if this provider is working with WIOA or Perkins or any others, Indiana sources of funding. They will tell you how many people are enrolled annually. All of that performance data is embedded under each program. What's missing here, and what I think is worth conversation, is what if there were another panel that showed you all the jobs, the actual jobs, the employers who are hiring, right? So instead of just seeing the training programs, you have this panel here. And then on the right-hand side, it's your job board, scrolling everybody who's actually hiring. So you could go to training programs, you could go to career, you could do career exploration. What if we built all of this together into a singular tool? Sorry, let me just advance my slide here. So then that's the question to you all. Is something like this of interest? And what other functionality could we build in that might be of interest? So could we, for example, build in a resume builder that allowed me to search not just on jobs that I'm qualified for, but maybe jobs where I'm missing 1 or 2 skills. And then you're popping up in a sidebar all of the training programs, the micro credentials, the short-term certifications that fill that gap. We know that lots and lots of companies are doing AI resume reviews. So can we build in a functionality that says, actually, our data analytics say that this word doesn't get through AI, this word gets through AI. So instead of defining your skill as X, define it as Y. It's the same thing, but this is the language that our data analytics tell us. And do we build in those data analytics? If we're going to run a job board, whether that job board is an aggregator of what's out there or our own, however we give Montanans a portal to job postings, what if we built in behind the scenes data analytics that we're looking to see what are the high demand skills, what are the high demand careers, and connecting that with our LMI so that our LMI is not just BLS data, but really some granular data of what Montana employers are looking for, what is going fast, how long are postings open? If they say we're hiring for these skills or at these wages, how quickly are they filled versus a different case example? Would we want to build in, if employers are posting jobs, support to employers? How do you make your posting more focused on skill-based hiring than degree-based hiring? Encouraging employers to consider shaping a posting as an apprenticeship rather than a fully skilled worker. How do we hire complicated populations with barriers to employment, like people who have been justice involved, veterans transitioning out of military service? How do we speak the language of military service in a civilian world? How do we account for people who are returning to work and supporting them in doing that? All of these functionalities they exist, right? The question is, how many of them do we want to incorporate here in the state of Montana into a singular tool? We don't want something that's so complicated it collapses on launch, but we also need to think about what's the best practice for encouraging workers anywhere they're at. K-12, out of school, career transition, just beginning. How can we create a tool that supports all workers, including populations with barriers to work, which is our core focus at the Department of Labor? How do we create a tool that engages employers, engages employees, and brings down barriers among the systems? So that is the question for us today. Knowing that there will be a RFP to redo some of these systems, at 1 or more RFPs over the course of the year, what would you all like to see? What resonates? What's interesting? Where would you like us to go?
And can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Understanding that funding is limited, how would you prioritize those things?
Yes.
I love the idea of a unified job board. It's a pain to try to post and know where to post a job, but I do fully understand it's also a pain to be a maintainer.
They're able to attach that to your workman's or not workman's comp,
Unemployment?
unemployment, so that, and I assume that a person has to register for unemployment, so when you get done registering for unemployment, it immediately takes you to a future job board.
Crystal, you want to talk through that a little bit?
They did just rebuild, our unemployment system. Whether that would be fully interoperable, I don't want to speak to because I don't think I could say for sure. But in terms of setting up a direct connection, I think all of it is behind Okta. So if they go through Okta to get in and do that, Okta, for folks who don't know, is just the state registration site that you have to go to access state services. And so I think that we could easily probably build a connection there. it probably wouldn't be as easy to integrate like these other pieces that we're talking about, just because it's been built a little bit differently already.
But I think at a policy level, there's an expectation that our job service offices will be working to support people who are on unemployment and getting off of it. That's a WIOA kind of underlying expectation that is a sector that is given priority. So there's a policy impetus to do exactly what you're talking about.
And we also have the RCCA program, which is anyone who is collecting unemployment, the folks who are most likely to, use up all of their, their 24 weeks. They will get pulled into the RESEA, program, which, it's our job service folks who have meetings with them about job readiness, resume preparation, all of those kind of things. And so in order to receive their payments, they have to go through that program with us. So we are already tackling that a little bit from that angle.
Are we behind the schedule on this because everybody's using Indeed? Is there a way to link it to Indeed so that we're not competing with Indeed?
I think you had thought a little bit about that.
Yeah, I actually, job boards are terrible for industry. And the technology exists today to do API integrations with software systems. And if the state's gonna put a job board together, that should be where the investment is. So a new job coming in can be put in their own business software. And I mean, probably would make sense to take our top priority industries and query which hiring softwares they're using. So we know that we can get the APIs built for them. And then that is a way to integrate a job board instead of, Indeed certainly would come into that process, but it's how does the employer not have to go to 10 different places and then manage these things, that it actually just comes back into their hiring tool. There's no reason that shouldn't be able to be done.
And that is the modality right now.
Yeah.
You go log in, you pay Indeed. Indeed is super expensive for jobs. Then you go to LinkedIn, and then you go to regional job posting boards. And then once you hire, you have to go back and all of those. I know of multiple nonprofits that have moved into creating job posting pages as a benefit to membership. And then trying to maintain that. And then I heard just another nonprofit was gonna move into that space. There's definitely a need, but there is not a cohesive solution. So one thing I would say, Jennifer, that resonated well with me, we can glean that information off the internet. It exists. There are ways to do that with AI, with sliders, And when those jobs go away, we can just refresh every day and keep it updated. But having something that was not just reactive, but proactive. So I'm just gonna use my own daughter's example. She's had more than 20 rejections from AI internship, where she gets no feedback. There's something in her resume that doesn't fit the AI, and she can't get through that barrier. Having something here that was enabling for people to figure out how to tailor the resume to get into it. Now that's proactive. That's valuable.
And like you just mentioned LinkedIn, and I know they match, or, that they have that pathway with the resume, with the resume building and matching to jobs if you select that tool, and it's not as expensive. Their resumes, I've heard, are around like $15, $25, something like that. And then they can share it with, the openings that align for you. So I think that that's interesting. But one thing that we've found challenging with Indeed is in the education world. I mean, I've gotten applicants from all over, and then I was literally interviewing someone that didn't know where Montana was. And I was like, do we have to finish the interview? Really frustrating. So I don't know if there's something to be said about a more local job board, but.
Other states, I mean, who's on the frontier in terms of states for usage of a state jobs board? I'd be curious, like, who's doing this really, really well? How are they doing? And then the second question, to Jason's point, there are like cast real time LMI firms that their job is being a jobs board aggregator, so to pull LinkedIn and Indeed. What boundaries on it, and say, here are the postings that we can find on all of the internet in this space.
Is that something that would be a value add?
For people who are in Montana looking for jobs, and that would be advantageous.
And sometimes I think for us understanding, some of that, or having more regular updates in terms of job posting data from across the internet.
I'd be interested to know whether we're talking about school counselors or college counselors. How do we give the counselors a better tool to work with kids, to support them in exploring a variety? What gaps do you see that could be filled by a system-wide collaboration?
I really like the way that you said, like, having that opportunity where with just these few more credentials, you could
Okay.
be applicable for this. Just thinking about our like class 4 licensure pathways now. I don't think a lot of people realize, you no longer have to get a 4-year teaching degree to be a driver's ed teacher. If you have these kinds of experiences, you just need to take this class. Or if you have, so many years in sheet metal, you could teach industrial arts by taking Indian education for all for Montana and filling out, a short application. So those kinds of things.
I agree. I think things are changing. Those counselors that are in those seats, things are changing all the time and it's hard to keep up. And they have to know every single job that's available when they're counseling somebody. And so keeping track of what does this person need to pursue whatever career they're talking about in that conversation, it gets hard. And then I know I've seen in those people are definitely leading people down the wrong track. Just because it was 2-year-old information, they don't realize there's, a new thing in Great Falls.
Yeah, sorry, I'm online here. I was gonna chime in that I think something that's accurate that doesn't need to be updated. Things move so fast and there's so many, changes. Like there's 4 different ways that you could become an electrician. That it's really hard for them to be experts at that. And so something that almost like train them to use the tool rather than making them like become experts in every different career pathway. So I think it's just got to be like you said, accurate. It's there's going to be people who actually use it. To Adam's point, like, hey, find out what the industry is using. If they get that, like, I don't know, that touch point of like, okay, I don't need to be the expert here, but I can see the path forward for this student. I think it's a really good update for them, because right now I think Jennifer, I think you kind of mentioned it. The tools are a little bit maybe, and no one's fault, but like outdated. They're hard to keep up with. Things move so fast that like people stop using the tool then because it's like, well, this isn't helpful anymore.
And it's a good point, Bo. And not to put too fine a point on it, but thinking about when you first started going through the 4 or 5 websites that contain all the data, career exploration to that WIOA site. And then it was a good contrast to Indiana, where I just thought about it from the user's perspective. If you're in that younger bucket trying to figure out what you want to do with your life, if you're in the middle looking for work, underemployed, or an older out of the workforce, all 3 of those have one thing in common. This thing's daunting. It's so the simplicity of that one-stop shop, if you will, not to, use that phrase in this context, but the SWIB, but it allows, and if it can be jargonless, when you flash up WIOA, eyes glaze over, and because nobody understands what that even means. So, if it's really, really tailored to the user, and from my son's made this point. He teaches 6th grade math, and he said, he just observed. He said, everybody that graduates, they fall into like 3 categories. They're going to be a nurse, they're going to be an engineer, or they're going to be a teacher. How do you think about all these other fields? But in fairness, I think Shannon, you said the guidance counselors, they kind of know what they know, and that's their, so the tool, getting that tool in the hand of students, just let them explore. You know, and you can start that as young as you want. And I do like, Susie, I just think your comment about so many more credentials. I don't know if this is what you were thinking, but I just got thinking the architecture of those pathways that came up this morning at this education design labs had them. But I think every school's got those built. What do you need to get this job done? Using that as the backbone to then build that out in a more,
Can
making
I ask
mistakes.
can I ask a question that kind of came up? How hard or easy is it going to be for like this system? And maybe we don't know the answer, I guess, for this system to really encapsulate like so when job postings come up and like when it's a certain industry. So I'll just use Adam's industry for example, RDO equipment. I think kids or the younger people, when they think of that, they think of the people who are, that are mechanicking the machines, maybe operating the machines. RDO equipment encompasses technology, sales, parts, all these types of things. How good are our systems or what we're trying to build here at like encapsulating, okay, this is a technology job in agriculture. This is an IT job in healthcare. I think, they don't think about, I want to work in tech. I'm going to go work at Billings Clinic. But how good are we at that? Or does that make sense?
Like almost like we need a little search engine optimization, a little SEO that's embedded underneath so that
So like,
keywords
is there
are
something
popping up
built
the right.
in that's going to put that in the correct bucket? Because that way, if it is, I'm like, man, that's going to really, I think that could be a game changer. Because I think that is something that we struggle against is like, it's hard to get younger people to think about a tech job in say healthcare or construction. They're thinking like startup or, I'm a software engineer for, whatever. I think it'll break some of those barriers down where it's like, those are really hard positions to hire because of some of those things. Does that make sense?
It's a through line of how different fields of expertise impact industry. So, I mean, applied technology in different industries, accounting, marketing, take your pick. I mean, there's a whole list of them, but people don't necessarily understand how the CPA works through, being a cost accountant to possibly a auditor to a financial planner to a CFO. I mean, all of those components, but how do I explain that effectively if you're just thinking about being an accountant?
And I think that's a lot of the work OPI's done, yeah, in some of those career pathways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think we just try to connect that together.
There was a little feedback on if you're going to an RFP. I think I would be cautious to go to, I only want to look at a complete system.
Okay.
Because I think it excludes some of the best potentially that are really excel in one and maybe struggle in others. And I think you can go all, but I think if you're looking, you should look broadly specific and all.
I think at least the internal conversations we have had have been about sort of a technology consultant / builder who brings in existing things rather than just saying, oh, we want Indeed to figure out how to do these things or whatever, that we would have like a contractor who is encouraged to go look at Lightcast or LinkedIn or whatever is out there to see how we integrate. Does that fit with what you're saying? Or do you see value in having separate portals?
Well, I mean, technically everything is separate, even if they're saying it's together. So being cautious not to get wowed by a flashy PowerPoint versus what real delivery looks like in this phase.
I would be afraid of trying to be everything to everyone on one site. I would almost separate by user. So educator, employer.
And I actually completely disagree.
Okay.
I think that's our problem. We have too many pipes. And we don't, we had 2 presentations this morning. Those should be combined. Frankly, we should be talking about how we get into the classroom and how we train the worker who's in the job already in the same structure, so that instead of we get so pigeonholed in all these things and we don't focus on the bigger picture.
But if I'm an employer and I'm trying to post a job, and I gotta wade through all the educator stuff, that's gonna frustrate me.
To post it?
Yeah, I would agree with you on that statement. I don't think it would be, that's a user interface limitation, not a system like.
Well, that's what I was suggesting is separate by users.
Well, that's a question I have for Joe
Well, you can have to
specifically,
bring it up
because
in a role.
the higher ed has its own resume portal system for both interns and professors. Is there any value in navigating to something that's more geographically centric?
So, I mean, I guess two items there. We have campuses that have a contract with like Handshake
Thank you.
Yeah.
that's about internships and job opportunities for college students. That's a, you know, that's a portal that's used by most of our campuses for that purpose. We've explored a little bit with the state, like how do we get more state jobs into those systems that are used at the campus level or vice versa?
Or maybe more important, how does this system
Speak.
automatically
Yep.
integrate, not add another page, but the API integration's there, so if it's posted in Handshake, it shows up in this one. That's how you
Well,
combine.
and I do think, you know, part of this discussion was, and I think to Bo's point, was about, okay, these jobs that are moving faster than our definitions of what an occupation is. And how we capture some of that.
Yeah.
I think that's what some other states are using as their vision is, hey, can we have some detailed language about what all of our training opportunities impart? And then similar language about what our job postings have, so that we can use AI and tools like this to understand that match or mismatch, or understand if if I have my resume and I upload it and it's saying, hey, this job might be a good fit, but here's the gap in your skill set that's going to make you a bad candidate. Here's the program that helps you to fill it. I think some of the challenge is the adoption of, they're all going to be using some similar language, or get to a point where we're using some similar language and have all of that in one system for any of those visions that come into being. And so I think part of it is not just the system and what it does, but okay, what's our actual route to broad adoption of such a system? Because that's when it starts becoming valuable in solving these, my skill sets don't match the job and I need to figure out how to fill it.
And that I think is really core in the credential database. So one of the reasons that states gravitate towards Credential Engine is they have created a common language for credentials. And so we can contract with them and they will populate all of the existing industry recognized credentials that are out there, but they have used their common language so that the way we understand that credential is the same here as it is anywhere else. And I think there's definitely indicators that that's a core entry point, is that we're all saying the same thing.
And I think it's maybe easier on the credential side than it is on the job posting side.
Agreed.
Right.
Yeah, but that a lot of the vision of the value of that is, I mean, it's valuable to have similar language around here are the trainings and credentials, industry recognized, higher education, K-12, et cetera. Here's how they relate to each other, and it's a really slick system. It's a slick taxonomy. They thought of a lot of stuff. I think where the value comes is, does that help us to figure out where people have gaps so that we can direct them to the programs that fill it? And that's the part that I've always been a little bit concerned of. How do we get to the point where small, you know, Montana, which is predominantly small companies, has the level of adoption where it's useful.
Piggybacking off of Joe's last comment, and being influenced by the Stillwater closure, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't 48% of the affected workers want to go out on their own and establish their own business?
It's a huge number and continues to be, don't you think, Crystal?
So I don't want to go a bridge too far with my thought here, but what if a part of this system is there's a how to start your own business,
Mhm.
or a link to the Secretary of State's website where you can establish your own business. Because to Joe's point, the vast majority of businesses in the state are small mom and pop shops. Yeah, obviously that's not the focus of our conversation, but we should have a component in there, in case people like the affected Stillwater workers want to go out and start their own thing.
Well, and maybe that links into the credentialing, right? So if I have been, working in X sector in automotive repair for a very long time, and now I'd like to start my own shop, maybe I need to be linked to a couple of 6-week programs on basic bookkeeping or whatever that help me launch into there. I don't know if that belongs in this system or a separate system that speaks, but I think what our strategic frameworks has said is that we consider entrepreneurship just as important as college, career, and military pathways
I
to.
think if like you pulled up the career and that could be part of it. Like 15% of our clients are pursuing self-employment, which is starting businesses. And it is really overwhelming to figure out what is a startup exactly in this industry, and for our counselor. So it could just be, I think it could be a tab within a.
I mean, we're in a labor workforce development group. I'm fully supportive of startups, but we gotta get to a place where, I mean, this is career pathing into, I mean, yes, small businesses are super important, but it also is, I mean, this labor component is also the volume. I mean, the number of employees, not just the number of companies, is critical piece of this analysis too. And we are not a big employer in Montana. RDO is not. We're a big employer, but we're not. So how these resources shape, and as you think about this process, I mean, you're gonna run into, if our message is we're gonna build everything for the startups, then business in general is gonna say, well, why am I at the
Right.
table?
I was just thinking of the placement option for WIOA. Participants, so that's where I was coming from, but I get where you're coming from.
And I also agree with you also, and Tony. We have a lot of members that are trying to find, if we just have a tab on that, obviously.
I agree.
It shows how to start, if you were thinking of your own business, don't start your own business, just a tab on, these are the steps and go about doing that.
Yeah.
So I throw in the agreement bucket, I also agree with Adam that, that's why I said I didn't want to go a bridge too far with this conversation, but it is something to consider. But yes, we are labor focused.
Well, and balancing, I mean, we need the pathway, and commerce probably is that spot, right, in a lot of ways, because that's how we want to grow new businesses, so that they can come over to this side to say, let's go hire people in my new business, so.
Well, and that's where I liked your idea, Jennifer, of having like the jobs available open, like in, the same page as the career area. But then for a business owner, I mean, if there's 10 plumbing companies in a small town and some of them are, struggling to find work, then maybe you don't want to open
Good information to know.
plumbing shop.
Yeah.
Like, I
That's a
don't know
good point.
how you provide that, but because it can be oversaturated to some degree on the other side, right? Too.
Is there any functionality that we've talked about that this group would say is not important or not a priority? I know, and you got 5 minutes to answer it, so.
Just bring that wheel back up.
I can, yeah.
Consideration to take, because you could just keep building and building.
Yeah,
Right.
and we have to scope an RFP at some point.
Would there be an opportunity, I think maybe with the funding and so forth, to have like the 2.0 and 3.0 to kind of tier it out? It's better to build the initial core strong and then have a direction and plan to layer on those next levels that could build into it.
And so what do you all see as the 1.0? What's the most urgent? I mean, the legislature is going to tell us if it's the career database or not. That one's going to be out of our hands. But again, I mean, we could begin with an Excel spreadsheet. We could be very beta about it.
I would say career awareness too.
Okay.
And we're,
The breakdown of Indiana with, we use, and then like the 16 to 24, which hits some of the other programs,
Yeah,
and then
that one,
adults.
yes.
Some of the work that we've been doing house-wise, that if you're anywhere from 14 to 84 and you want a job, we will move to. Just like seniors, trio of workforce events for senior citizens when you go back to work. And some of them are also very similarly to high school students, looking to map out their next career path. Our session on Wednesday had everything from a former nail tech to a recent cardiothoracic surgeon retired, all trying to figure out what's next. So I think having something that can speak an initial level to that audience is great. And then the 2.0 is getting kind of down to some of the more granular things.
I like that, Jennifer, because it touches on sort of the thing it's come up several times today is how do you incentivize, tap, or help those people not in the workforce? And the people you mentioned might not be in it if there's not for those tools.
One of the things I put in your memo, I think, was a link to the Pennsylvania version of this, where they do exactly that. Your front doors are, they have adult, young adult, K-12, and then all sorts of doors for people who face barriers to work, returning to work, senior service, military transition, justice involved. So they've created entryways for all of those populations, and that would be an option as well.
Did you?
If the job board is sunsetting in a year,
It's going to become urgent.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think something needs to be done in that space.
Our IT folks do have a transitional,
They
plan
can
for us
manage it.
to, we'll be able to meet the basic requirements, for our required reporting and for our programs. And essentially limp along until we can get
Yeah.
something. Yeah, we don't have to have something up and running by then. But it's not gonna be fancy, so we don't wanna drag that out too long.
Maybe a related question though is, of those visual systems that you listed, Jennifer, which ones are currently used by most people?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'd be interested in how many people are using it.
Does the credential database exist?
No, that would be brand new, directed by the legislature.
Mostly small businesses.
I think that's important. If you can enter it.
At a sophisticated level or at just a legally compliant level?
I'm just interested in the less you're the lawyer. That is very uninteresting to me.
But that's the core question, right? Like, do we swing big on a credential database? Or do we just comply with the minimum expectations from the legislature? Is it important enough to the sector that we put a ton of energy into the platform for the database and use it as the way to access career awareness, job board, all of those things? Or
So as I see it as an employer, I would love to be able to have a database that allowed me to tie a job I had to a series of credentials that seem like they should fit and a way to track through of where I can get them. That would be really helpful if that's something that makes sense.
So I just had a conversation with Crystal on the site. Who's using the job board right now? Predominantly very small businesses for entry level position.
Yeah.
So I think we need to keep that in mind, but we're still not gonna be probably getting Boeing to put professional positions on.
no,
Well, but that has everything to do with what we articulated. We're not gonna go and put our stuff on another job board.
Right.
We're
gonna have to go pull.
Most of the employers are just they're not willing to do that.
And maybe for the small ones, we have an upload feature, but
Yeah.
the predominant is a pull, an aggregator.
Yep, I would have.
Do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I misunderstood, not to take the conversation to build the whole wheel, because that wasn't the question, but your legally compliant struck me. Are we, I thought I heard we're required by either WIOA or we're required to have the ETPL.
We must have an ETL.
So to that end, does it make sense to have that, or would that be something you'd put separate?
Well, that's the core question is, do we want to integrate it? And by integrated, I really am, I mean, we have to have it and it can continue to exist the way that it does now. It's perfectly fine. But do we start connecting it to, if you're gonna be an ETPL, then you better be giving us better data back to our next conversation on metrics that matter. You better be, offering some of these credentials. You better be meeting certain performance standards. Like, is it going to become a thing to be on this list, that this is meaningful? Or we could gonna continue to do what is legally compliant, which is, here's the application process, here's the data sharing agreement. And that exists now. We could do literally nothing on the ETPL and there would be no harm, no foul. Or we could clean it up and integrate it into a system, and maybe that becomes a 2.0.
So,
Where I think,
no, I'll just say, sorry, Joe, if I understood what you said, Jennifer, are you saying we could either build have a much more user-friendly handoff, demonstrated pathway and career awareness, how you get to where you want to go for that career field, or force the ETPL people to fit?
Do you have thought? I know you have some thoughts about this before I answer Paul's question.
I think that it would be important for us to consider tying our ETPL to where the demand is. That is the priority in my mind.
and I mean, I guess 2 points. First, yes, there is this driving need that by December sometime, DLI has to have rulemaking, develop a list that's credentials of value, non-college credentials of value that will be tied to state funding for high schools. An ETPL is intended to be credentials of value that WIOA participants can use funding to access that lead them to a job. I think that that's a valuable discussion to have. It also helps, from my seat, focus the college system and saying, hey, here are our criteria where we want to make investments in training pathways and programs. And they're in, kind of the criteria that fit for the ETPL, fit for the credentials of value rulemaking. And I think that's a really useful conversation, in part because that helps lawmakers and policymakers drive funding that support training programs. Where right now, apart from WIOA reporting, we don't have a lot of information on what those training programs yield.
So here's what I mean when I talk about integration. You could see here, if I wanted an associate of science in accounting, these are some places that do it. And if I click on one of these programs, the Indiana Institute of Technology, it's going to give me this basic information, a link to the provider. If I click on summary, it's going to tell me, do they have industry collaboration? What's the program description? It's going to tell me a little bit about the program, right? I'm going to get some data here. They don't do job placement. It's going to tell me what credentials they're issuing. Yeah. But then it's going to tell me things about the quality. So you'll see here on the right, the WIOA metrics that we're required to track. And you can see here that this place meets minimum, it meets some exceptional. So this is where we talk about the integration of the ETPL to actually give qualitative information into a credential database. It's not just that the credential exists, but we're not going to take them off the list because they're bad, perhaps, but we're at least going to tell you they're not meeting certain performance, or they are meeting, or, this is some information about it that is qualitative, that helps career counselors, that helps individual job seekers, it helps employers to know what's out there at a more granular level. That's what I'm referring to. Is this an urgent priority? Is this a 2.0, 3.0?
A quick question. In building something like this, just like with the job board, we were talking about the maintaining of information. There is a tremendous amount of work in maintaining all of these pages, because every time something tweaks with a particular program. So within the funding for doing this, is there going to be a dedicated team to actual updating?
Yeah, it's a great question. Go ahead.
What I believe we have been looking at as the most feasible model would be essentially looking at COGS products that will talk to each other, like what Adam was talking about, and mushing them together so that from the user perspective, it looks like a linked system, but from the back end, it's a bunch of different vendors doing their thing. That's
So when
gonna
they
be
update
probably the
their
most
data.
affordable, because our folks can support from within the agency, the basic functions. But we're not gonna be trying to do all of this,
Right.
making updates, yeah.
No, but the data gathering exists already. Like, this is the data we are gathering on right now.
Yep.
We're a little over time, sorry.
No, we're good. We have till 2:45.
Oh, yeah, you're not
So we're
letting them have a
skipping the
break,
break.
are you?
But if we're done,
Hey, driver.
But I mean, is there, in last pieces of feedback, things that you really want DLI to consider as they're crafting these RFPs?
Can I chime in here really short? We kind of, I guess, talked about this, but I think I'm thinking about like supply demand. Like, hey, how do you make it so that employers get like a return on investment of like, hey, we're getting people from this. How do we make sure that like the the students or the job seekers are getting there? I feel like the more you can focus on like the getting the students, the job seekers, the adults that we want there, and the more you can like pull from like Adam said, you post it once and it gets on there. You don't have to go to a specific site. I think if we can focus on just one of the supplier, the demand more, it has a chance of actually being a tool, because there's a lot of these where like, oh, if you don't do the proper marketing or whatever, people don't use it because I post something on there and I never get anything from it, or I go on there to look for a job and I don't find the things that I want. I feel like if we could kind of like skew it towards the supply side or the people, the employer side, the more that can be automated and easy will make it so that everyone kind of has that return on investment of using the tool. I don't know if that makes sense.
You're gonna help us get it into every school, right?
I mean, I'm like, that's honestly what I'm thinking of. Like, how do I get everyone to like, what does that look like? What is the training or what is the hook? Like, how do you get them? So it's like, hey, this is really good for your, like, this is just like, why wouldn't you use this? Or, you don't have a choice not to use this. I'm with you. I was already thinking like, how do you get that to happen?
I was being a little tongue in cheek, but I love that.
Well, I know that when School District 2 starts telling other school districts how to do things, that goes over gangbusters. So both should be tip of the spear here.
You need to get on. Yeah, you need to get on that. Your kids are
Just
missing out on
Billings does it, why
opportunities.
can't you? Anything else that we should prioritize, deprioritize?
One thing I think that we should prioritize is maybe a lot of discovery in the RFP development process. Like, I'd be really curious for career explorations, folks who aren't using MTIS, what are they using and why?
Okay.
And similar, some of the jobs board or resume, it's like understanding for our employer populations. And how do we understand what they're actually interested in? Because a lot of the dangers of the larger vision of this, I think, are twofold. One is we overcomplicate it.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, and then no one uses it. And second is that I think the real value to the Department of Labor and the real value to higher education is if a lot of folks are on one system, that means we got to get a lot of folks on one system. So that ease of adoption value statement has to be really clear. And I want to figure out where to find my data. So that's my
Okay.
If you guys have other things too that you think I know where to find me, please reach out with more feedback if you have some.
yeah. Good discussion.
I think as we develop an RFP, we'll have time to run it back through SWIB so you all can take a look again. Might have to be by email, but I think we'd like to have some ongoing feedback to make sure that we're hitting within kind of the scope of what the board sees as relevant. Anything else you want to add, Crystal, before we wrap this and let people at least have 5 minutes to stretch their legs?
Okay.
We have to take a vote on that.
No, I defer the 5-minute break.
Are folks online able to hear okay? Bo, can you hear? Okay, good. All right. So the next topic that we're going to talk about, and this is going to kind of front load our conversation that we're about to have on where we go next with our strategic framework, is what does this board want to measure? If we are going to launch these initiatives, whether it's the one that we just talked about a career pathway portal, or whether it is the progress on our strategic framework, or even our basic federal compliance requirements, what does this board want to measure? There are some things that we must measure, and we're going to talk about those. But from your perspective as the workforce partners, the workforce system here, what really matters? What are the indicators that we should be tracking to know if the state workforce system is delivering on what Montana taxpayers need and deserve, if it's meeting the expectations of this board, if it's accomplishing something that's important? So this is kind of an esoteric conversation for me. I'm not inherently a data person. Crystal absolutely is. She's a million times smarter. I believe it's Dr. Armstrong, isn't it? Actually, yeah. So we brought some people who really know what they're talking about. And the question then for this group will be, what do we want to measure? So there are some things that we must measure, and those are established in WIOA. So as you know, SWIB oversees the formulation of the WIOA state plan. And in there, we put forth our vision for the state workforce system, some of the goals that we want to accomplish, and then at a minimum, we articulate the data gathering around the required metrics under WIOA. But certainly this board could, and many state workforce boards do, articulate additional metrics, additional measurements that are indicators of success that matter. So these are some of the things that are happening right now in the state that can give us a foundation for deciding what metrics really matter. Which indicators do we want to track very rigorously and very aggressively to know if we are moving in the direction of success? So I've mentioned the WIOA required performance metrics. The Montana Post-Secondary Workforce Report has a number of evaluations that are very important to indicate success. Crystal mentioned earlier reemployment services. There has been an evaluation of that program underway with the Minneapolis Fed. And then we've talked quite a bit today about the out of the labor force report. Are we moving people out of the labor force back into work? So these are some of the things that exist already. And we're going to talk about what metrics are in those as indicators. And what I'm really hoping that we'll have a conversation about today is which of these really matter. Which of these would you like to be tracking to inform your decision-making, first as a board, but then as individual participants in the state workforce system in your individual and respectable roles? So these are the 6 required performance metrics under WIOA. And you've seen some of these as we've talked a little bit today. You can see the top 2 are employment. They are slightly different for adult versus youth, but in general, and these apply across our WIOA plans. So these are not just DLI metrics. These are all WIOA providers track these. And these are as a part of, we just talked about the ETPL. Reporting on this is part of what it means to be on the ETPL list. If you are a eligible training provider, you have to give us data back to help us do this. I think it's fair to say that measurable skill gains is the most complicated right now. How you determine if anyone's actually moving from point A to point B is complicated. And I think effectiveness in serving employers is still a little bit suspended. Aren't we still waiting on some guidance?
Nope, they've got that firmly in place now. That one is different than the others, though I would note. That is something that we are going to be expected starting in October to report as a single metric across all 3 WIOA or titles.
Okay, all 4, yeah. And then one of the ones, and I think what sparked this conversation is, as Paul just mentioned, is we are required to track the credential attainment rate. So how many people are getting a credential? But many states, at least what we heard at NGA, have said that's not super interesting. What's interesting is, does a credential matter? Do employers report back, actually, yes, these people with X credential or Y credential are more prepared, our on-the-job training, our onboarding has declined in time or cost. So some states have said credential attainment is fine as a floor. What we actually want to measure is the value of the credential in the workplace.
Isn't it kind of chicken and egg? So if you don't have the reporting, you can't get to qualitative.
Yes, it should be a feedback loop, right? Yeah, exactly. But as a bare minimum requirement, this is what federal law requires WIOA providers, WIOA programs to track. So this is a series of metrics that exist right now that will not go away anytime soon. The post-secondary workforce report was chock full of metrics. Here are some that might be of interest to the workforce board to track over time. So I'll give you just a second to take a look, but you can see, I mean, the incredible data team working together with OCHI and the MUS has looked, this report was published in 2022. And we could continue to track some of these over time, depending on which ones you all say, these are really the ones that we'd like to follow as indicators of how we modify our work as a state workforce board. Fields of study, workforce outcome, employment, graduation rates, income over time, how long they stay in their field, what field they end up going into. These are all things that we could be tracking. In addition, the reemployment services is undergoing a pilot evaluation, sort of a pilot project. You can see what's available to us here. This is predominantly focused on UI, so you can see those engagement with reemployment service, total weeks claimed. Yeah, I think it's fair to categorize these as pretty minimal on the program participation, right? Did they talk to someone? Did they stay involved? But then, you know, looking at things like wages, employment, how long they're on unemployment. If the board has an interest in really focusing more on unemployment, please tell us. I think in general, given unemployment rates in Montana, we have not spent a whole lot of time worried about UI engagement, reemployment engagement. That has not been the particular challenge that faces Montana right now. If someone on this board feels differently, please share that information with us.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. We have a very large market gap. Yeah. Right. So unemployment focused data gathering has not been a priority, but certainly could be if the board directed otherwise. You may not know this, but if you hang out on your website, you have data dashboards already. You can see there's some tiles in the middle, and then on the left-hand side are all the data that is currently being tracked and provided to you. So you could hop on this website and get just about any type of data that you want out of our labor market information folks. But then the question to you is, as a SWIB member, as someone who oversees the statewide workforce and is setting the policies, priorities, and making recommendations to the governor, what here's actually useful to you? What do you want to look at before we come to this meeting and say, okay, I see we're on track. I think we're off track. This is only useful if it's being used. And I think if we were to look at hits on this website, it might not be real high. So the question is, what kind of data dashboard would this organization really like to see developed? Here's a whole brainstorm of other things that we are not providing to you on a regular basis, but potentially could. These are many things that other states track or that we have heard feedback on. So for example, it is a priority for the governor to track the number of new jobs for Montana graduate programs. That's a big deal. He wants to see that expand throughout schools throughout the state. So that's probably something that we should be tracking. Go ahead.
Graduate, like as in?
Jobs for Montana graduates is a program. Right. Yeah. That is a program of like sort of soft skills. 80 schools now? Crystal, is that right? That we're in 80 schools? Yeah. And he'd like to see that grow significantly. We could, what I've heard from the board today is this out of the labor force population is important. We don't track any metrics on that, but we could. We need to start having a conversation as we head into the implementation of a strategic framework of what this board wants to watch and what will be our indicators of success. So I throw this sort of very high brain dump to you to ask you what matters. For those of you who've been here for a long time, for those of you who are just brand new to the board, what do you want to know at every quarterly meeting? What do you want to have at your fingertips in real time? What do we want to put into an annual report that matters to your decision-making? Not just as a SWIB board member, but in your individual industry workforce partner capacity. What matters?
So
you sort of touched on it before, but I've said this a lot of times before, and you hit on it there, Jennifer, about this unemployment rate. you know, as a SWIB, I guess if we're in the labor market or labor, all we're worried about is getting people placed. This board ought to give ourselves an A. I mean, we're down where it's at. Whether it just happened because this board or that's what it is. But then that gets the same thing I've said 100 times. When you're that low, we need more businesses here to hire more people. You know, and is that our job or not? That's what I heard on the conversation a little bit before. If 50% of the people are quit want to do that, if it isn't our job, I think we gotta find somebody who their job is and get them Stillwater people back to work. And you said 50% of some of your people are looking to be on, or,
Self-employed, 15%.
15, wanting their own businesses.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's some big
I
numbers.
think our commerce department, I defend you a little bit, are
Yeah.
doing a pretty darn good job on new business attraction and helping in that space. So I don't want you to read mine as a negative comment, but I do think.
Oh, no, I would actually like you to, send that to Mandy Rambo.
Give you a shout out.
I send that, and then you come with me to the conference. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's one of the things I still see is that, you know, because I've been on this board since when unemployment was high.
Mhm.
That's when you try to get people work. When it's low, you need businesses to hire.
Yep.
So that's the way I've always looked at this board. Who are we targeting, you know, sometimes like that, yeah, we need to get commerce.
We're doing it. We're doing the things.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, I don't know if while you were in this room, saw the governor's press release today, but Montana was named the number one state in the nation for startups today.
Congratulations. Good job, commerce.
Tony, you can't book surprise. Now we gotta figure out how to get them qualified workers.
That's right.
So
Wow.
three things kind of jumped out to me that if we think about data that would help this board in making decisions. So if we're looking at trying to connect youth with career pathways, people that are underskilled, unemployed, out of the workforce with employers. Just data that I think would be interesting would be, you know, what is the longevity or, you know, what is that churn by industry? Just to get a feel for, you know,
Job turnover.
what industries have a bigger problem, what strategies
Yeah.
might be dealt around that. One might be kind of work, it was on that, it was on one of your screens that had a bunch of squares. A lot of them were graduates, so it might have been out of Joe's shop. But one that I liked was workforce outcomes by program. I mean, you know, how are we thinking about that labor market in terms of the people that are trained in the job availability on the backside of that? But then also the average time jobs are open by industry. That would just give us more of a granular perspective of the qualitative ability to hire by industry and what maybe structural impediments can this board assist with to drive that number down.
Which one is this for?
It was the
Oops, sorry.
workforce by middle far right.
Workforce outcomes. by
Yeah,
program?
I like
Okay.
that just because, you know, we're a big state with a lot of diversity. So, and I know you've got that data. I've seen those maps. They're brilliant. They show how many workers are needed in this part of it and how many we're training, just breaking that down by industry. But those three things might help give this board just sort of a forward-looking data shot in terms of what can we do to shape it.
I agree pretty much. Paul shared one thing that we talked about that Dale mentioned at least a dozen times that I remember is the hardworking Montana work ethic. Is there a metric we can put around that, like productivity per employee? You already mentioned longevity in the role, that we could quantify that as a differentiator for our state.
I would question that, but every agrarian state claims the same thing. Nobody can prove it.
So how do we measure?
I don't think there's a way to measure it. Nebraska's gonna tell you the same thing.
I would say, I'm sorry, Patty. I would say we measure that work ethic in our low unemployment. but not just the, what is it, 3.2 or whatever, but it's been that way for 40+ months, right? And we measure it by, thank you, Commissioner Swanson, the number of startups we have, right? I can't give you a number for, my work ethic is 5 versus hers is 6, but, on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever, but I think we see it every day by the number of Montanans, whether, 5th generation or been here 30 days, who show up to their job, and bust their tail, or are working in, their garage or bedroom or basement to, further their startup.
At least to my understanding, there's a couple things that relate to this that I don't think we can measure because we don't gather the data through unemployment insurance or through other sources. That's match between the training program to the role. Like, are you working a role that makes sense for the training you went through? Or sometimes things about the hours of the plant, so we can't actually measure it. Have a good understanding of, well, what's your wage rather than what's your total earnings. I think things like that could be, useful as a goal long term to think, okay, how do we better inform the system? I really like the regional workforce planning component here, and to think, hey, for the council or for Great Falls, what's the data that they wish they had when they're meeting with their chamber, their community college, and I think we have some folks that we could do some focus groups with to understand how do we build utilities at this level that empowers them on the regional workforce planning level. And that also perhaps, our friends at UPHHS and OSHA and OPI with Perkins and DLI with WIOA that help us to coordinate some common planning and common requirements across those different programs that all connect to workforce system planning in one way or another.
Longevity, how long is somebody worked there? That should be an easier track. Who are, W2, and job satisfaction. It isn't always about the money. There are people with careers that love what they do, especially in the retail and food service communities. They're out there with people have been places for 25, 30 years. They love it so much. It's not all about the dollars. It's the satisfaction of the employee in any industry. But the days of the 30-year-old careers have gone by. When people change from 10-year is what we project, and then somebody's going to want to do something.
Yeah. But you raise a really good point. So if we're going to track something like longevity and career, does this board feel comfortable saying, well, this is what we would want to see? Like, is it just interesting to know how long people stay in career, or is our expectation that people will stay in a career for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years?
What would be helpful for industry to know, am I above the average or below the average? That would be helpful for us. And I would tell you, our analysis says if we don't lose them at 5 years, we usually keep them for a career. So if we've been able to figure out the process to build that trust and confidence after 5, the length goes much longer on average.
So if we did sector-based or industry-based averages, then you all could benchmark companies and say, we're doing okay, or we need to really, okay.
And a projected on what's the replacement. 20% of your workforce has been here for 35 years. What is the projection of replacement for those?
I think that's the key. That if you could get a histogram, this is where it'd be be nice to have all the data in the world that we probably can't get, but I mean, and Adam, you mentioned the 5-year thing. We had the same conversation 10 years ago. I said, you talk about a turnover rate in average, but the truth is it's all in the first 5 years.
Yeah, right.
And so how do you create that stickiness so that everyone doesn't walk out of the door with 20 years and you've never got anybody that gets past 6?
So there's a point within that. So you're talking longevity with an organization, but there's a career pathway, right? Is there a way to trace or have data as do people progress? Like yours is very easy. You progress every 6 months or 800 hours, right? Is there a way that we can find that career progression that exists?
I think we can easily track, Crystal, wage progression, right?
Wage progression.
So that's easy. Whether or not that is just merit-based or actual title change, I don't know that,
Do you track title change too?
I don't know, Crystal.
Not typically, the wage progression we get from UI, so
Yeah.
we have that, but it wouldn't necessarily follow or be indicative of a specific career path. I mean.
Some folks collect roll. That's challenging.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be something we could do reliably across everyone.
Would there be an opt-in option for industry that said, we want more data, so we're willing to give you more? That could be interesting. I'm not speaking for our future.
But that, I mean,
You're right.
to Patty's question that I think he's asking Krista right now, if employers opt in, then we can get at some of that work ethic. Because then you start getting lost time, you start getting productivity, you start getting revenue per employee metrics, things that don't exist publicly, but would exist within companies.
Oh, that is so
If
powerful.
you could give us like we get with some of the industry reporting benchmarking we provide our data and we get back aggregated and we know where we work. So that there's some trust that the data is not going to get, diced out by individual employer. But we do that in a lot of spaces already.
I think as a follow-up to Adam, this makes me think about the talent pipeline management process, training and chamber. And the two parts of that process, one is if you're looking at your educational programs, you're looking at what are the programs for certain careers or industries? 6, what are their enrollments? What's their attrition rate during the program? Because that can send up some flags of mismatch or what have you. Matriculation, and then available open spots. So do we need more capacity or less? And you can look at that regionally. And then for employers, the job market data that we were talking about, that's current time. That doesn't give you any indication of the future. And so part of that TPM process is there's a feedback, going back to the confidentiality part of employers. TPM looks at it as what are your anticipated needs in 2 years? It's a pretty short window that it looks at, but you could pick a different one if you wanted. It's something that would give a forward movement indication on trends. There could be, again, with how fast so many things are moving, certain things could be really great now, but could start to either taper off as they transition to something new, which would open new questions, or could continue to build, which would indicate needing more capacity for training.
So the talent pipeline management program is through the U.S. Chamber Foundation, right? And is that employer-based only, or does the chamber as an entity take it on for all your members? How does that work in practice?
So the state of Kentucky does it throughout the state. They've divided their state into regions and industry sectors. So they have a person, I can't recall this through the state itself or their state chamber, but they have with the racing industry. So that's one sector. They have the eastern part, big healthcare focus because a big need. They have distillery is one. So they have it broken down and then they kind of subsets underneath that, where then they run these cohorts within these different sectors. But the great thing about the TPM process is, as they'll say at the U.S. Chamber, you can take that and just deploy it however it works best. For Montana, these are just population to others. I think there's probably opportunity on a statewide level to get more of that information. Because I've looked at it, of doing some. Really, you know, it's hard to sanitize the data when you look across, you're like, who could that be? You know, some of it is it's too small, but in the larger.
Often when we get anonymity, it's got 4 or 5 as a minimum reporting entities, and then you can get granular data. And the way generally we've seen it, we can boil it all the way down to, and I suppose we could do it even further down, but county, and it's, keep that 4 or 5 minimum, and you get the data, and if you don't have it, you go out to the next bigger segment and capture it there. That's how I've seen it done.
But all the plants I managed, #1 indicator on workforce was employee turnover.
Yeah.
So I think you can pick that up off of the payroll and not reported by company, but reported by county or state or something. That would be somewhat of an indicator if we're trending up there.
I think tied to job type would be really helpful, because you lose a little bit of if you got a really high turn role versus the rest of the business, it would be helpful to have some type differentiation in that process.
Purposes might be hard to benchmark there.
Huh?
Tourism might be hard to benchmark there, right?
Well, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
One thing that came up in our education summit yesterday, what percentage of the employees in Montana are remote? And are they remote Montana companies, or are they remote for out of state companies?
What would you like?
That's hybrid still. I do both. Yeah. So I think that to Amber's point is, if we were to track a metric of the number of employers who are remote, what would this board do with that? Encourage it, discourage it, train differently, recommend different
But
skill sets?
and also, I just asked Jason, what would you classify need?
And I knew the answer.
He's had trouble, but.
Yeah,
he's
that's
probably
correct.
right. But the question is, what is remote? Is it a company, is it
Yeah.
a person working in Montana for a company that doesn't have a business in Montana? A physical presence? Or is it somebody who physically works remote?
Right.
For a company?
And to what end? What
Right.
is that a good metric? Is it a bad metric? Does it influence how we train people? I mean, what would this board do? That's what I want to push you with on these metrics, is we can do a lot of, that'd be cool to know. But what I want to know is what drives your decision making.
Yeah.
In terms of, gosh, this is a red flag, or this is a green flag, or, oh, this is an interesting development. Let's make sure that we're recommending that OCHI and MUS credential in this area. I want things that drive decision making. So help us
I think job.
discern.
quality is discussed.
So talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's, having some sense of a vision of what are
Good job.
characteristics of high quality jobs. And is it advancement? Is it benefits? Is it pay? Is it what have you? And because we can have a heck of a low unemployment rate.
And everybody's underemployed.
Right.
So I think there's probably also an important part of that about the progression opportunity, because we have to have entry level roles, because there's nowhere to get people into the process without. But how does all that look in the process? And understanding where wage compression happens in those middle intermediate roles, and how we, as a business community, navigate that process.
I was just thinking about the work from home, on-site hybrid. What would we do with it? When I think about the work from home, this gets into a business decision by the company, right? I mean, if we knew how many people were there, that does create some sense of labor pool for domestic Montana companies that are off the radar, but they're here. The problem is a lot of people moved here because they can maintain their higher wages out of state to be here. But if I think Jason, in your world and Christina Henderson's world, and I know this is way too simplistic, but might you be able to encourage that? And the tech sector has been on the forefront of this forever, but as you've got this growing disparity in cost of living and labor availability in, say, the Bozeman Missoula corridor with, let's just say, Eastern Montana High Line, are there ways you can create workers in a place that can afford to live versus, because they're not, there's a point where you just can't bring more people into Bozeman, space limitations and cost limitations. Is there a way to encourage that? That said, I would think those businesses are already doing that, right? I mean, that's not novel or new to them, but is there a way to encourage economic growth beyond just the zip codes? Yeah, the zip codes that are already brick and mortar that are in people's minds. That would be one thing you could do with it. I think along that line, this is a bit macro, but, and we already have it. I know I see it in the data that Amy Watson pulls together, where you look at employment by industry, but also GDP by industry. And this gets back to the 6 sectors that are in the strategic plan. I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves here on the agenda, but if we had that data kind of updated real time, it would give us a sense of, do our 6 sectors remain relevant as we go forward in the strategic plan?
But on the GDP measurement, I think you're a year behind before you ever get it.
That's what, you're gonna have more people in the service sector, but what value does it drive? So how do we think about it? And so, good point, Patty. I don't know what that number would be. You're right, that's dated.
Crystal, do you know how often we get GDP data?
I don't, but I can find out.
BDR, I have to wait a year.
I'm looking at another salary report right now, and one way they track progression wasn't job title, but salary versus years worked. Or wages versus
That's
years
interesting.
in position.
Glad you brought that up, Jason, because I had a note, upskill correlation between upskilling and wage increases, but I thought that was too bold to ask, so you just did it, and I think that would be super interesting. And what you would do with it, you could identify, you have stalling by industry, what can be done to retain people, because they're gonna see turnover then
Other
correlate.
industries like what we talked with Dale that have a very good outcome
Right.
in 5 years, 6 years.
Yep.
I think that sort of touches too to what Joe keeps stressing, which is, do the credentials matter, right? Is the upskilling actually delivering a wage increase or something?
One of the things, we could, the governor, put the upskilling, tax credit in place, but we're actually not tracking it to any skill or credential. And we had the same experience in Washington State, and it is actually tied to one. So I don't know if that's possible or smart. I'm not making an argument either way, but it's different, of how do you start tying those things together so that the registered apprenticeship program or the credential becomes meaningful in the process and then trackable, I suppose, in the effort.
It's a really good question, Adam. Not only the governor's MTAX tax credit,
Right.
but today the House passed a further expansion of an apprenticeship job growth tax credit. I can think of 3 that are directly tied to either apprenticeship or training incumbent workers that we could totally work with Crystal.
When I got that from our HR director, what does doing the registered apprenticeship program, what benefit does it bring? We're doing the work already. So what does that extra step actually provide? And I didn't have a good.
Tax credit.
Yeah, well, it doesn't, but yeah, so. Well, and I'm not looking for a tax credit, but it was this process, we're already investing in it, we're doing the work. It's just, there's no visibility anywhere to that in the process, so.
And the taxes are complicated for big companies. Credits sound great, but do you have the tax appetite? Meaning, are the credits of any value or is it a carry forward?
Yeah.
But
Small businesses have much more appetite.
they matter to an owner But if the people making the decisions in a business are not tied to the ownership, then tax credits don't make any difference. So it's an interesting piece of political tax policy.
So everything we've talked about here has been employees landing a job and tracking the employees. We spoke briefly about commerce and business attraction. Well, what about the negative? What about companies that choose not to be in Montana because we don't have the workforce? It would be very interesting to understand.
Lost opportunity.
Yeah.
If anybody knows of a good data set for that, you let me know.
I'm looking at Tony.
It's just
right
gonna
now.
be Tony's gonna count.
Tony's like, I'm sure what-
I'm not in data, he said.
But you're touching on a really important topic, Jason, that when, and this is beyond the scope of this board, but it touches this board in terms of Montana's got it's got a very unique tax structure compared to other states. Because of how taxes are levied, the two-legged stool of just property taxes and income tax, it creates this interesting disincentive for capital investment, especially with the business equipment tax. So if you're a larger company that has a capital allocation decision to make in terms of what state to put money to, Montana's often getting the short end of the stick because you're disincentivized to make large investments. As opposed to, if you're a big energy company, I'm kind of maybe speaking close, but at the end of the day, that's a job. Those are jobs. Those are opportunities. That's community development, and that's an animal we're not going to take on, and probably the legislature's not going to take it on. But I mean, at some point, it will be. But your point, Jason, is the tax policy is huge in this.
Well, that's lost opportunity. Are we tracking job reductions, not job growth? But
Efficiency, automation, yeah.
Wish there was some way to get a sense of, I have no idea what this would be, but it sticks in my head all the time. Licensure barriers.
Okay, say more about that.
Well, just, so much work has been done in the last 3 years about, or more than that, when the governor first came in, talking about how do we lower the barriers, giving people credit for work experience versus, we talked at SWIB meetings years ago about how, if you're a hairstylist in one state, worked there for 20 years, Montana's not going to give you the license without hoops. I mean, how do we, and legislature's had several bills in that. I think they had some this year as well, but it just keeps going back. It's obviously still an issue because we're still talking about it, but I don't know what that data point would be that you could actually track, because everybody's board's got their own board of licensure. So it just keeps sticking in my head that when I think about this board trying to create employment and getting people back in the workforce, what barriers are on that licensure side that are either slowing or creating inefficiencies to work? I have no idea what that would be, though.
So of our 23 agency legislative proposals this year, 14 are occupational licensing reform. All 14 passed out of the House nearly unanimously. The worst we did was 96-4. Of the ones in the Senate, all of them are unanimous out of committee, but have been waiting in the president's office to be scheduled for the floor for anywhere between 1 and 3 weeks.
Okay.
So we're anxious for our floor vote, but when the whole package comes together, all the things that we've all wanted to see done in occupational licensing will essentially be done. The silos between types of licenses, whether it's processing licenses differently, processing non-routines differently, that will all be standardized across all 200 types of licenses. We're going down from 29 to 22 boards. And for the first time ever, I can't thank our friends in this union crowd enough, especially Clinton, who fought this fight with us in the Capitol several times. We've done 2 things. House Bill 246 defines substantial equivalency, which if you've been involved in licensing, you'll know is the oldest fight in the building. So we now have both a definition and a declaration of how we will award substantial equivalency. That's the example of your barber and cosmetology friends who have a license in another state, don't quite meet our requirements. What is the process for evaluating equivalency and getting them there? It's obviously different for a barber than a plumber. But we spent 18 months in the interim hammering it out both with organized labor and all of the other licensed professions. And thankfully, there was only one licensed trade in Montana that objected in the legislature to any of our bills. That's the massage therapy licensees. They are very particular about things staying the way they are. But beyond that, we had uniform support from all of the associations. So fingers crossed, we'll cross the finish line. We're running out of time, but I'm optimistic that we'll get there.
Awesome. So you can, all my comments, you can just put done.
Done. Tony was a little faster in terms of delivering the best state for businesses, but you were right there. We're really good.
It's like my wife.
Oh. Made a better job.
No, it's true, Jim.
Yes, yeah, we put out a report. DLI puts out a report on it, yeah.
But in licensing, one thing that is useful there is you guys do have a great dashboard that shows our active licensees by age and location. And, you know, not that licensed occupations are everything, but a lot of the key, does a business want to site here decisions, dependent part on some of those licensed occupations. And that might be useful to say, hey, what, in addition to, you know, the job demand forecast, this is a little bit more micro inspection of some of our key teachers, doctor, health professions programs, and are we gonna face a demographic cliff?
Good point, Joe.
What about, to sort of Jason's point that we focus largely on workers, what about metrics related to employers? Effectiveness in hiring veterans, effectiveness in creating, you know, workplace learning experiences. What about some employer-based metrics?
Employee turnover rate is the best measure of an employer.
I think
Yeah.
employee satisfaction.
We're gonna get a little privacy, concerns here about what we're
But
reporting.
if you aggregate that,
Well, to some degree, they already have it, right?
they have it, and they're probably not gonna give it to you, but you pick it up off their
Yeah, payroll.
payroll.
Yeah.
And to some extent, job postings, right?
Okay, one that we haven't talked about, benefits. So we talked about wage, we talked about salary. I looked at the benefits today, and I'm like, well, dang, I wish I knew about that. That's pretty nice, that pension. Free pensions. What are the, and a 401k, benefits package.
The union is forced saving, that's what I would say, force you to say. But I'm like, bring up employee satisfaction, because you know, we're pretty much the same across the board with 27 employees. Why do certain people want to work for certain companies? And when we're at the point where we got low unemployment, you know, what's the situation? And believe me, I explained today, it's not always money. I mean, you can go to Big Sky and make tremendous amount of money, and the opportunity is there for the individual, but they are, no, I'm happy where I'm at, and what drives the employees? A couple of years ago, I seen, I think it was an advertising employee where they come out from Billings with the 10 top or 10 best employees to work for. I think that's something to do with advertising.
Yeah, usually.
Not a real good way to measure it. But I don't know how you would measure it, but you know, when you're selling your stuff, you want to come to me because people that work here are satisfied and they say good things about our company. I don't know how you could measure that.
One metric we see in our community for which companies are performing better is just median wage of that company versus the rest of the industry.
And there's a related measure, which is firm size. You know, we can create a lot of new companies in Montana, but we kind of struggle with getting big companies, medium-sized, growing to bigger, medium-sized companies, which national statistics, big and medium-sized companies pay more, offer better benefits, are more productive per employee. So from a wealth of the state of Montana standpoint, figuring out how we support small companies to become big companies, or big companies to the state is a question. I don't know if that's a workforce board issue alone, but it's an issue.
But it's also kind of opposite to the entrepreneurship. So Montana has the highest percentage of manufacturers with less than 20 employees in the entire nation, including Alaska and Hawaii. Is that a good thing for entrepreneurship, or is it a bad thing because they're not growing?
I think it's a balance piece there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a healthy mix where you get both, or you really get the benefits. Silicon Valley is a great example of that, where some of the biggest of the big are lurking in the neighborhood, but the startup community is just vibrant. So, I mean, that's a good balance.
And like for us as a small, we are a small business, like we have less than 5 employees. And so when you have like Steel, the place in Lewistown that is pulling people right out of our northern Montana college. I mean, and we're bringing those college kids to us and they're training with us. And then as soon as they graduate, boom, they're gone because they offer $30 an hour, where small Amber cannot afford that for a graduating person. So, and they're doing the 1-year welding out of Northern and they're making $30 an hour. My husband don't even make $30 an hour.
One comment on licensing. And I'm not sure how germane it is here, but the qualifications for our teachers themselves. So with a graduate degree, I'm able to teach at the college or and graduate level. We have a lot of industry people who, near the end of their career, want to give back and go teach. They can teach in college, they can teach in 2-year. They cannot teach in high school as well.
I think Susie's team can tell you more about some work that was done over the last 4 or 5 years to really expand class 4 licensure to do just that. What I think it's under, but
Yeah.
that might help.
Yeah, I talked about that just a little bit earlier, and through the work of the Board of Public Education, we did expand a lot of those opportunities and pathways, and that's something that I was mentioning a couple of examples of earlier that I don't think a lot of people realize are available. So you no longer have to have that teaching degree, and we're trying to get people from the field, even if they can come for a day from the industry, or if they're, towards retirement and willing to come in, you can use your experience rather than that teaching degree. And with, some basic coursework and paperwork, be able to provide, your knowledge to the students, and it's a really exciting and something that we need to get more information out there about.
And Susie, you have some pretty good success stories out there already, don't you?
Yeah, and I was the superintendent in Townsend, and we couldn't find a driver's education teacher. I had a highway patrolman with 25 years of experience. He was a driving instructor for the highway patrol, and he, didn't qualify to be our driver's ed teacher, which was just really frustrating. Right, so I did that. That's kind of part of this work that was started. I was on the vice chair on the Board of Public Ed at that time, and we got that changed. So things like that can take place, and you don't have to go get a teaching degree. You can use your experience and share your knowledge and wisdom with students, and it'll help in the industries as well.
Is that,
I wasn't aware of that.
Is there,
CTE or across all fields?
It's many fields, I wouldn't say all fields. A lot of the CTE fields, like I said, driver's education, and others. So there's a lot of new pathways and opportunities. There's also new programs like ABCTE program. So folks that want to be a teacher that were a paraprofessional or just in some other kind of industry but don't have the teaching degree, in under a year and a half, and for about $1,200 in evenings and weekends, and remotely can get their teaching certification. So there's a lot of new opportunities.
and I think as we head into the discussion about the strategic framework, this sort of employer behavioral questions is kind of a bucket of things to consider. what do we want our employers and our industry leaders to do as a part of the workforce system? Yes, we want them to hire, pay well, train well, all those things, but do we also want to see them, becoming teachers, participating in local sector base? Like, what's the commitment to an occupation or an industry or a system that matters to you all, that you would want to promote or discourage? Are there some behavioral metrics in terms of how people are engaging in a system that matter to this board to track and make recommendations accordingly? You don't have to answer that because I'm going to ask you again here in about a half an hour, so it's okay.
How you measure, certainly.
Yeah, and that I think is a question, at least one that Crystal and I talked about a lot. I don't know, Commissioner, if you have thoughts on this, the amount of or original data gathering that this board would like to see out of our economics bureau. The amount of surveying and going out and gathering things that are not standard BLS data or standard, existing data sets. What do you want to see us out driving? And then obviously, what's feasible from an FTE perspective. But I think that's an ongoing question, don't you think?
Yeah, I was really excited to see you start this conversation today. We have the typical data sets that we collect that government thinks are good.
Yeah.
That's great. We'll keep doing that because they're required. But what helps you drive your day-to-day, whether it's the JATC? What are you looking at? How do you know if you're winning? Maybe it's your business, maybe it's your association, Jason. What are you looking at? And how can we be part of that so that we're capturing those on a more macro level too? Crystal's team continues to impress me that they can collect almost anything if I give them the money. So we'll figure that out on the back end.
She wasn't here to hear it. It was all good.
So the economist team is really our superpower. They can do a lot, but I'm hoping that this discussion and this group can inform them on what is meaningful and what are you tracking now anyway? How do you measure ROI and workforce investment? Is it number of apprentices enrolled? What is it? Because if we are truly going to be an advisory group to the governor based on industry and labor's perspective, we should start with your perspective. And Crystal's team can do almost anything.
I would tell you that, and we're not great at this, but we're starting. The forecasting of need in hiring and coupling that with an honest assessment of what expected turnover is something most businesses don't do very well. And so as you think about this, trying to figure out what the demand is, I have a plan, I need 3 service technicians to hire in this store by the end of the year, but I didn't effectively forecast the 2 others. One retired earlier than I thought, and one decided to leave. And now the demand is actually 5 to get, and often you just get back to treading water in that sequence. And so that process of how do you actually think through what your demand is, which may change your perspective on your investment in time. And then industry cycles also impact these pipelines in a major way. When things are really good, everybody's all about participating, and then an industry cycle turns and they get broken. And how do we not do that or work as a partnership to mitigate those pipeline pieces that break around that? I don't know if that's experiences that we do, so.
I've heard a couple different questions from folks. And the barrier that we run into is like, either that's not data that we have, or we wouldn't have complete data or anything like that. Would there be any value in providing you all with some tools to conduct your own assessments, like provide the framework where you can plug in your numbers, you can plug in your positions, something along those lines?
I think it would. I'd also, now that you're here, I think an opt-in option for a select group of industries that said, we want to come and do some more deeper data reporting. that we could get meaningful data back from that was very industry specific might be something to consider in the state. And maybe tie to the priority careers but if you had that opportunity to come in and say, hey, we want to be a part of this, and the other people in the industry could do that with you, it could be pretty interesting. And it'd be voluntary, obviously. It could be, speak for myself, I'd really prefer it to be voluntary.
So Adam, why wouldn't the Contractors Association?
Yeah, it'd be that would be a great example of bring it under a trade association. Maybe the chamber's got a group that makes sense. I mean, the hospital association could be another. I'm just thinking out loud, but.
And then the local sector partnerships that are part of the strategic plan can be a part of that too.
Right.
Those employers sitting at the table could
Right.
say, this is the data that we'd like to opt into.
Right.
We'll give you data, you give us some qualitative analysis
Yeah,
back.
hey, I can actually give you my real my turnover number for this designation of people. And if we brought it together in a way we knew it wasn't gonna be shared individually, I think there'd be a number that would be open to doing that. And you can start experimenting with some meaningful data sets that you may not have had before. And then you could just expand it if it worked and if you'd like this data, you have to provide the data. That would be a good way to encourage participation without requiring it. It's just not available to you if you're not gonna participate. So we'll give you some high level stuff, but if you want to get into more in your industry, you gotta be in the game.
I have a thought on that, but it's not fully formed. I'm thinking about what our agency already collects from employers, right? And it's in all of our divisions. So I think what I hear you saying is something new and opt-in that Crystal's team, the economist, would collect, which is great. But then I think about the burden on reporting we already put on employers. So employers already report to us quarterly all of their wage and information based on UI, as well as based on workers' comp annually. And then they also report to us regularly if you're in a public works contracting space, your prevailing wage surveys. I hear from employers a lot, their level of frustration with me that across the hall, we don't talk to each other. Why are you all asking for the same information?
Yeah.
I promise we're trying to align systems.
Yeah.
But I wonder if there's not a way that Crystal's team can curate some conversations with our other folks that are mandatory collectors anyway, and just get line of sight to data. I hate to create new collection models for the same data.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly.
So to respond to Commissioner Swanson's question, labor specific, but one way we look at health or quality in companies are CapEx expenditures in the region. That includes building, that includes buying equipment, as a sign that there's growth happening in that space.
But I, as a manufacturer, don't want you to know that.
Yeah, and some of it's public, some of it's not. Buildings. Facilities.
I don't want you to know which machine.
Yeah.
There's discounts in the state for CapEx expenditures.
I'm gonna pivot to strategic framework update.
Yep. So this conversation, we're going to come back to in the context of our strategic framework. But just to kind of update SWIB, as you know, when we last met in January, the board voted to recommend to the governor the 406 job strategic framework. Commissioner Swanson and I very fortunately were able to squeeze into his schedule yesterday to present this to the governor. And I think the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. I will tell you the governor was, from my perspective, very deeply engaged in it, had many changes that he wanted, and had very strong opinions about what he wants to see here. So I saw a pretty significant level of engagement, and I'm going to go through some of that feedback with you. What I think I do want you to know is the thing I was most concerned about, and the thing that I think we talked a lot about here, was the defining of the 6 high demand sectors, right? We acknowledge that that's a little bit art and science. It is mostly driven by gaps between jobs available and workers to fill them, but there's a little bit of art in there too, in terms of saying we have to have educators and childcare in order for any of those other sectors to get filled. So even though those might not be huge numbers, they are a critical enabler. And acknowledging that there's some sensitivity that our incumbent industries, our production and extraction industries don't appear on there because they don't have those same levels of wage gaps. I think the governor understood that very well and said he was very willing to back those sectors. He indicated those sectors aligned with what he believed to be the demand sectors in the state of Montana, and understood also that this is not about their GDP value or their historic or legacy value to the state, but really about this is where we have a gap, and that is where we should focus our attention on. So did not hear any pushback on those high demand sectors, and then heard a very strong push that, you know, appreciate the global nature of the strategy, but he wants to see us developing annual work plans and annual priorities so that we are very clear on what we are working on at a state level. And I think I heard a very strong commitment to local sector-based strategies for local talent pipelines by occupation. So he wants to see that local driven work. He wants this board focused on a couple of key things that move the needle. Is that fair at a high level? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go through a couple of things with everybody today, just to kind of get us back on track, or I mean, back current on what we all know. And then we could talk about where you all would like to go from here. So when we presented yesterday, this is not a slide that I had presented, but I think it's important that we keep our eyes on these sort of big global challenges that SWIB will have to deal with. There is a churn of about 79,000 in the workforce every year. Much of that is just turnover, people going from one job to the other. But on average, 35,000 people either leave the workforce or there are new jobs created. And it's mostly leave. It's about 31,000 leaving, 31,000 or a little less leaving, and a much smaller percentage of new jobs being created. On average, our system, ordinary operation, supplies 22,000 workers. No, 24,000. So we end up with an 11,000 per year gap between the number of workers who exist and the jobs that they need to fill. I will tell you from my perspective, and this is something that this board can debate, not all of those jobs are high priority to fill. Some of them are very low wage jobs. Some of them are jobs on their way towards obsolescence. They're not necessarily something this board needs to focus on. They may be the way that a teenager enters the job market, and that's great, but that's not a public policy focus. Some of those jobs are highly subject to automation, to elimination, to efficiency in the system. But there is some portion of that is a genuine, persistent, chronic, projected for the next 10 years gap between the number of workers that exist in a system and the jobs that they need to fill. But that question of the jobs they need to fill is the next level of complexity, because we don't just need more people, we need the right people. We have not just an overall gap in the number of people in the workforce, but we have them in occupations, right? And that's why we defined our high demand sectors. So we don't just need more people, we need people into the occupations. This board oversees the workforce system, and I think we have to acknowledge it is fractionated, it is duplicative, and accordingly there are deficiencies. There are just gaps in what we're doing because we're either not communicating well or we're working over top of each other. And that's something that SWIB, I think, takes a core role in eliminating. That is driven by federal statute, that this board exists to advise the governors on ways to make the system eliminate communication barriers, collaboration barriers. That's what SWIB does. We heard from the governor, and I think we all acknowledge, we heard this in August, he wants to see us replicate best practices. Many, many, many incredible local efforts to develop workforce exist, and they sit at the pilot stage. They sit at the little local stage. He wants to see SWIB elevate those stories, tell those stories, and find ways to spread them around the state. So how do we kind of incubate success and communicate best practices? And the one that I continue to hear when I talk to people, and I would hope resonates with you all, is that if we're going to work on solutions, either locally or at a state level, we have to do that at industry pace, not government pace. If they come to us, and I think this is what we heard from the micro-credentialing conversation, if they come to us and say, listen, we've identified a strategy to fill this occupation, we need a credential, we can't get back to them in 24 months. That industry will not stay engaged. Our employers don't have time for solutions that take months and months and months to develop. And so what we heard from the EDL work is that this can be done very quickly. And I think that's where we really have to keep this is an industry-led board for a reason. And so it's incumbent upon all of you to help all of the workforce systems stay at that industry relevant pace so that we can sustain employer engagement. So no overall changes to the 4 pathways to work, 0 barriers to employment, 6 high demand industries. That was well received, well supported. We have talked about having some global goals, and this is a conversation for us to have today. So we've talked about the largest goal, every Montanan with a pathway to a career and a plan to achieve it. We've talked about the out of the labor force population, and we're going to keep talking about it because it's the low hanging fruit in closing that gap. But then we had a conversation with the governor yesterday about what he wanted to measure numerically. For instance, does he want to measure the number of new entrants into the workforce? And his answer was no. He put back two things to consider, and that's one of the discussions we'll have today. I think his largest interest is in developing a workforce system that the private sector invests in. I think we heard that in Glendive. So do we want to have as a global goal the expansion of private sector partnerships, whether that means investment in the K-12 system, whether that means sponsoring apprenticeships, whether that means more work-based learning, whatever that means, do we want to be setting as a global goal that private sector engagement in the workforce system? The alternative that he had suggested was, rather than the net number of people coming into the workforce, is it interesting to track continuous growth in labor force participation rates? So right now, Montana's labor force participation rate is about 63%, which puts us straight at the median. We are on par with the US rate. Utah and North Dakota are the highest in the country at 70%. That's largely driven by their demographics. They're just a younger demographic. But I would also note that North Dakota, among its prime working age people, has a dramatically higher labor force participation rate even than Utah or Montana. So there is this capacity, there's this interesting factor of labor force participation rate. My question to you all, not to be answered right now, but towards the end is that interesting as a goal or as a metric of success? Do we use that to measure the efficacy of our policy interventions, or do we actually focus our time and attention on increasing the labor force participation rate as a global goal? And then lastly, we want to set as a goal, I think the governor had an interest in increasing the number of Montanans achieving financial self-sufficiency. This is something that comes out of DPHHS frequently, and it is a meaningful goal in a world of Medicaid expansion renewal, right? So we have that has been signed into law, Medicaid expansion is done. But if there is a risk to the state's budget, can we attack that not by changing participation rules, but by reducing the number of people who need it, right? It's 138% of the federal poverty line to qualify in general for Medicaid expansion. So should we focus on the types of wages that allow people to support themselves and their families without needing to rely on pick your program, Medicaid expansion, SNAP, whatever it is? Can we, and should we, and I think the governor's response was yes, please do, focus on moving people not just into work, but into work that supports themselves and their family. So this, other than that number 3 there in the middle, these are going to be the goals for the strategic framework. And then towards the end of our time here, we'll talk a little bit about how you all see that third goal. What is more interesting to you as a system to track? So as I mentioned, our first strategy here for Pathways to Work, we want to elevate both military service and entrepreneurship as meaningful pathways into work. No changes there. This was well received and understood. This gets to Joe's point earlier of common language. We want all of our workforce partners highlighting all of these pathways and recognizing that people will go in and out of them over the course of a lifetime. So when we talk about getting that common language, that system unity, this is really what we want to make sure everybody is talking about, and that we're really developing information in terms of what's happening in workforce in all of these sectors. I think the governor in August talked about kind of like a map of projects. The Ready Montana, the Work-Based Learning Collaborative does this for youth programs. So you can go and see in a single place what's going on in all of these areas that is relevant to the workforce system, so that a employer or a community college or a K-12 teacher in my community could replicate. So well received all of this. This is a part of getting to our common language and our common commitment that each one of these pathways is relevant to the workforce system. Zero barriers to employment. So this is what we have talked about as the focus of our statewide policy effort. The first 4 pathways to a career, unifies our system. This is where we focus our policy at the state level for things that cut across industries, cut across occupation. These are barriers widely. And so we've talked about employee issues, employer issues, and system issues. And if you'll remember, we even talked about realigning the SWIB's committees to fit this, to have a committee focused on prepared employees, engaged employers, and a system responsiveness. This is where I think the governor leaned in the most and said, agree with all of these, but I want you to focus on a couple of them first. What we very aggressively heard, and I think we've continued to hear, is childcare must be a priority. We have to figure out how to get the 29,000 people who are out of the workforce due to being unable to access childcare, as well as the tens of thousands more who are underemployed because of inability to access childcare. We have to find solutions to that. We heard very strongly an interest in making corrections and reentry a focus. That is something that was clearly important to the governor, and something that he would like to see us focus on. This K-12 system collaboration with employers, very important, gets back to that question of public-private partnerships. Are we doing the kinds of things where employers say, I will invest either my time or my money in middle school, high school, even elementary career awareness exploration, because these things are moving the needle? Then are we developing efficiencies for employers to work with the K-12 system? That was a clear and loud priority. That public-private partnership is something he wants to talk about a lot. And then this incubate, replicate, and scale success. He wants to see this board focused on best practices and communicating them around the state. What's really working in workforce development, and how do we get more people to do it better? You're going to see that in terms of expanding registered apprenticeship programs, expanding JMG programs. All of those things were front and center on his mind, and were the feedback that at least for year one, he'd like to see public policy recommendations around these 4 areas that you see in red. And then last but not least, our 6 high demand industries. Again, no pushback on what these are, understand that they matter. He definitely had a preference, I'm not sure I'll get this right, for wealth generating sectors like the construction trades and the manufacturing trades, but understands that they are enabled by some of the other supportive sectors as well. So no change here other than a very strong focus on local public-private partnerships. Wants to see those sector-based occupational collaborations be very local level driven, not state driven. So he talked about about identifying in every community sort of who's your workforce lead, who's the champion, who's the ambassador for the workforce system, and making sure that they're convening and bringing the stakeholders together in each of these 6 sectors that matter to the area, right? In some parts of the state, some of these sectors matter more than others. So what we recommended here in terms of sector partnerships, developing sector-based strategies to address their local occupational gaps, was well received and supported, and something that he would like to see us move forward on. The governor does like to use the strategy of OGSM. And this is what we offered to him as a very high level OGSM. And where I would focus your attention here is on what's on the right-hand side of the page, which are metrics. This again is just a brainstorming list. SWIB will need to focus in on the ones that matter most. What do we want to track? And I can send this out to you guys so that you'll have it to look on and reflect with. I did not send this out in your board packet because I didn't know if we were necessarily going to have yesterday's meeting. But back to the metrics conversation we've just had, what do you want to track? What matters to you? And most importantly, I think to the governor, and I hope to all of you as well, is what sustains our employer engagement. As we show progress along a particular metric, what of those metrics make employers say this is worthy of my time, whether I'm participating at the state level on the public policy strategies or on the local occupational sector strategy development, wherever I'm at, they are telling me, the state are telling me that what we're doing is working. So we have listed some here, but we'll want to hear ongoing feedback from all of you. This we went through, no changes here. So that's where we stand. I think what we had proposed is that sometime in the very near future, there would be a launch event with ongoing public, communication, marketing, awareness of this. But that is the feedback that we've been given. So ideally, the governor would announce this relatively soon, and then it would be go time. Go time for us to communicate this around the state to stakeholders, to get input and feedback and begin formulating those local sector partnerships, and then begin developing the public policy that bring down the barriers to employment.
Congratulations.
This is your guys' success. You developed this. So I was really thrilled to be able to share it with the governor.
Can you go back to the one with his priority?
Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing I may add that we probably need to think hard about is how we the incubate, replicate, scale. We gotta tell the story.
Yeah.
Like Dale's program, scaling and doubling in this, that's a story we need to tell statewide. And all of the other stories as we bring them together, we've gotta celebrate those efforts and create some visibility for them. It's a really important part of how you incubate and replicate is they gotta hear the story.
Yep. Oh, Shanna's gone. I was gonna say Voc Rehab does this really well. They do case studies that they send out. They do annual reports, annual newsletters. And I think we have some of our partners on here who do this really well.
Work-based learning collaborative.
They do it really well. Yeah.
Adam, who would be the audience for that, would you say, just generally?
I mean, obviously the the public would be an important audience, but I think, where do we weave these stories in places where both employers, educators, and they gather? So the state superintendent meeting, the state principals meeting, the contractors meeting. So how can we get these messages into the public sphere in a place that makes a difference? And it's gonna look a little different in every industry and every, but part of our challenge of the collaboration with the K through 12 side is the teachers don't know or hear the story until it's in their school, but how do you get it to their school? And so that I think we should think hard about that part of this. How do we actually get there is the communication around it.
Back to the 4 pathways slide. So the common language aspect is really attractive to me because in some degree, we're all in our own pockets and silos doing workforce development, but like we all know, we talk about it differently. What do you think you need in your industry or your company or your JABC? What do you need from the SWIB and the department and the governor to launch this so that we're aligning language within your first and then start to spread those seeds?
I think the biggest piece to telling this story, I think, is that other slide that talks about the industry is when we talk about the trades, we're awfully in the construction trades, we're often talking about the entry level role and not about where does your pathway. So in each of those priority industries, do we talk about, hey, getting in is critically important because once you're there, here's the way you can go. And some of these actually are pathways back to them, but it might look different. So how does somebody in the military get back to the construction trades or so we start broadly telling the story of those industries. Maybe we get good at it and they become not a problem and we pick four or five more 5 years from now. But we help build that kind of, okay, it's not just the entry level role we're only concerned with, it's how do you get back to them?
Well, and that's what we could house when we talked about the delivery system, right?
Yeah.
The career awareness, the credential database, putting that all together, that's where that content can live.
So I've never seen any data on incumbent workforce training. And that, I know there's a lot of money spent in the state on it, but I don't know how much and which company.
Okay. So having heard this, now I want to ask the question that we just got asked, which, what are the metrics that matter? What do you really want to measure here?
One of them be that, I mean, we picked these priority industries because there's a gap.
Mhm.
So that gap should be a measurement.
Yep.
That, are we making progress? Maybe that is the headline. Are we making progress on the gap or not?
And I think my comment on GDP by industry, so we can keep a relevant 6,
Mhm.
that's, I misspoke, that should be the gap.
Of those metrics I saw up there, the top one, workforce participation rate,
Mhm.
seems like all the ones below it. If you're doing well in the ones below it, it'll affect that.
So then, Patty, you're hearkening back to the initial question I asked, which is of the global goals of the framework, is labor force participation rate our goal, or is expansion of the private sector engagement in the workforce system the goal? Right, that was the,
If I could just make one note about the participation rate, that rate is also very highly responsive to the state's demographics. And as you know, we do have a lot of folks who are gonna be retiring, who have started retiring and will continue for the next decade.
Mhm.
So.
Is that what I'm buddy? Is that?
it's messy,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, in my mind, there's just so many variables of people that maybe actually aren't even looking, so, I mean, why do, we can't move to that one.
Well, it's an interesting question, right? So if the demographic trend is against us, this board could say, listen, we are graying, but we don't want to be that way. So instead of focusing our time and energy, and I'm not suggesting this, I am giving a hypothetical. Instead of focusing our time and attention so intensively on training who we have to focus equally intensively on talent attraction, right? That we're going to launch a statewide talent attraction.
Or youth retention.
Or youth retention, or slowing even, slowing the people who are leaving and retiring early. I mean, we do have a larger portion of people who are leaving the workforce at 55, 56, 57. Our labor force participation among people over 65 is about 10%. It's quite low. So, I mean, there are ways to get in there if that's what you want to focus on. If the more interesting goal is private sector partnerships, we could track labor force participation as a metric that might be interesting, but maybe your goal then is instead, are we getting the private sector truly involved in what is going on in the workforce system?
Is that something we track here?
What's that?
Second.
Not at all. Partnerships. I mean, we know them anecdotally, right? We know that Gallatin College has these advisory groups and that schools have industry advisors for CTE programs. Like, we know these things anecdotally, but I don't think we track them. I don't know if you guys do for the 400 school districts, how many have.
Well, in industry, MMEC.
Yeah.
Yeah, the schools do, they are required to, for the Carl Perkins requirements to submit their meetings and the attendees. So
Okay.
we have a list of every business in each community that attends the Carl Perkins meetings.
I reflected, Jennifer, on the meeting you and I had with the governor yesterday,
Mhm.
when he was providing his feedback on each of the kind of components of this and especially the goal. I think I heard him say 5 times public-private partnerships. I'm
Yeah.
curious, what would tracking public-private partnerships look like to this group? What's the metric? Maybe, I don't know, Joe or Crystal, that living data, what does that metric look like?
Commissioner, too, I would ask, what's the true definition?
Yeah, back to common language.
Time is a critical one.
And money.
And financial obligation, whether it's direct or in kind. I mean, those are the metrics that if you're not in with both of those, you're really not in.
And I'd agree with that. I think that's part of the concern is, I totally agree with the strategy. I think it's a very hard thing to measure well. I'm trying to figure out how we approach that.
I think you could look at something like new public-private partnerships established. That way we wouldn't have to be focused on trying to find everything that was already out there. But within all of our, respective areas, we know what's happening. And so if we have one group identified, probably our team, to be tracking something like that, That might be one way to capture it, or at least capture things that we are intentionally working towards.
Mhm.
And I think if we were celebrating a benchmark like that, the ones that exist will come out of the woodworks to get on the
Yeah.
dashboard.
Yeah.
Well, and I think also if we really lean in hard to this idea of localized or regionalized sector-based partnerships, the natural inclination of those is for people to say, these are the strategies that we think we need to implement to fill the gaps in these 4 occupations that matter to our community, right? Where's the money for it? What,
Follow the money.
but the money should be the industry, right? If that sector-based partnership is doing work that matters to industry, rather than industry volunteering its time as a community service, then industry will invest in those strategies because they're the strategies those employers need to get people into their jobs. So it may not be an absolute metric, but if our sector-based partnerships come back to us after 6 months and say, here's our strategies, do you have $10 million to implement? That's a failure in my mind. What they should come back and say, we've developed these strategies and industry is funding these 6. It's these 2 that are global that we can't get industry buy-in. Is there some sort of public money for that? And so I actually do think we will create a measurement opportunity if we do the sector strategies properly.
I think the industry would be much more interested in you helping us break down the obstacles that we
Correct.
find in our way than paying for it.
Yes.
Because that by far is the biggest problem to try and build momentum.
I think the magic's gonna be, how do you create? What do we do about driving private sector partnerships into the areas of the state that have school districts that have less than 300 students? Because my concern is that it's gonna be much easier to drive private sector partnerships in larger communities where you have a greater industry presence. When you get into, I think it was Grace mentioned Ecolak. When you get to Ecolak, you know, the primary employer is likely going to be the school district and maybe NCRS or BLM, or, you know, how do you then create those in those places? And how do we affect that? And I don't know, I don't have a good answer. I'm just, when we track it, then what do we do with it in terms of, you know, ramping it up across the state?
I think part of the industry participation is that, you know, kind of thinking about what we do is around the dollars tied to a student going through a program. So to go build and recruit the pipeline, you know, our headline number today is $34,000 to get a service tech, which we're paying tuition, a signing bonus, and a tool allowance for them to go through the program. Not everybody needs to be at that number, but if you can get industry at whatever level to say, hey, we're willing to come in and take a couple of students in this process, and, you know, a $1,500 scholarship is what we're gonna provide at the end of it. But allow that to count as the industry participation. It's going to the student in that process. But that is industry coming to the table and saying, we care about this gap, along with the time we're gonna spend in the program as a sponsor, and the equipment provided to make it a reality in the industry. Those are the things you start to quantitatively show and are able to say, here's how we're gonna move the ball, and you collect groups that are in similar need, and you start building it.
Jennifer, I'd be concerned for a public-private partnership. Private's putting in effort, time, money. The state's gonna do that too.
Yep.
There's gonna be a capacity constraint with the state government on this.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we've got a great superintendent, a really good commissioner of labor. I think we've got momentum to commit state resources to solving problems and a direction from the governor to do so. I don't know if I'm over speaking.
Yeah, we have the Advanced Opportunities Grant, for
Yeah.
example, which is
Yep.
expanding
Out there
in
already.
the, you know,
Yeah.
which could expand in current legislation, but right now schools have money. Honestly, some of it's hard to spend. If a lot of it's going to the dual credit opportunities because those pathways are a little bit easier, where especially in the rural communities, we're having a hard time partnering with businesses where we could be using that funding for PPE. We could be using that for tools, for hard hats. We could be using that funding to close the gap of the work comp insurance because of the students being young, we could offset the cost for the business owner. So we do have those funds and in some areas we are just having a hard time or like, you know, in Townsend, our high school counselor had 400 students that he was also supporting with mental health challenges and other things. So, when is he, you know, gonna go sit down with the businesses and get these kids going in a program? So that was tough. And I was thinking about what you said, Paul, and, you know, our hospital was next door, one of our largest employers in Townsend, but we didn't have anything set up with them. And we know that we need healthcare, we need folks in healthcare, so it's like, we need to, you know, we need to get this rolling. So we've just gotten the advanced opportunities grant, and that's kind of the next step. But also I heard you talking about elderly care earlier, and I know that we had a lot of job openings in the community in those areas too. So thinking about what do we have in the community that we can connect with, or in neighboring communities, you know, sometimes in Montana, we might have to drive half an hour. We might have to send some Townsend kids to Helen or Three Forks or, you know, whatever we need to do, but I think it's worth it.
So interestingly enough, that flags for me, the very definition of the silos that we forget to talk to each other in government. In 2021 and 2023, the legislature, both times was Representative Harvey, now Senator Harvey, first passed a bill, and then in 2023, he eliminated the sunset of the bill, giving DLI the authority and the funding to pay those work comp premiums for workers if anybody would apply to us. To my knowledge, there's nothing they would never apply. But we have the program and the money that just sits there. And so that just highlights for me again, we need to communicate better.
You've also opened it up for us so that the school actually considers it a part of their, if they're in a approved program, it's their.
So that was Representative,
Yeah.
out of Great Falls, former superintendent, it'll come to me, Anderson maybe. 2019, he passed a bill that essentially created a three-legged stool for student work comp, that if the student is paid for their work, they must be covered by work comp, which is where Harvey's bill came in later to clean up. But if the opportunity of the employer is unpaid, then the school's insurance can attach both in transport and that workplace learning opportunity.
Great.
And that.
Great, Anderson.
For a high school-based type in-class program, that worked really well for them. But I like the idea of, if we're gonna go to the next level.
And public-private partnerships don't only have to be in the K-12 system. I mean, they could be with apprenticeship training programs, they could be anywhere, right?
I wonder if it would be helpful, Crystal, I'm thinking out loud, but we should make a list or a document to share with SWIB of all those little widgety programs that the legislature has given us over the years. I think it's the right time to share those.
Sarah,
For, pre-app and pre-employment transition services that we contract with the high schools, we're a little over 100 right now. But if they go into work-based learning, we're, putting them on the staffing agencies, and we pay the wages and cover the work comp. So that's another thing that's super underutilized. That relieves these other pieces of the system to support.
This is some of the obstacles employers encounter.
And these are.
You're just finding the right person at the right.
Yeah.
Or just have Sarah within
Right.
a shot, but you get to the second connection you need to get to.
well, and part of the sidebar conversation we were having earlier was that parents need to know also, because we had, you know, parents would say, when we sit down, kids would talk about, especially at 16, they could drop out in Montana, which of course we try not to make known, but they'd come in and say, we're gonna go to work, you know, and it's like, you can do that and stay in school, please, like, don't do that. And we tell them about these programs and these opportunities, and they're like, why don't we know about any of this, you know? So we need to do a better job of letting parents know with their students and be able to have those conversations that you can start, you know, working on your associate's degree and stay in high school. You can start an apprenticeship program and let them also have those conversations with their children about all the options and pathways.
Great conversation. We're behind 5 minutes, but we're still gonna get out of here on time, as I promised,
So-
despite taking a break.
I think next steps just for everybody will be, we will let the governor and his team make an announcement and then we will begin getting to work. DLI has a number of things, I'm sure OPI does too, that are gonna require stakeholder engagement over the summer. And this will hopefully then become a part of that conversation.
So that empowers the committees.
Yeah, and that will be a question that the executive committee, who will meet next week, will need to decide is, are we going to restructure our committees accordingly? So given that Paul wants to get us out of here on time, if folks have thoughts about committee restructuring, please send them to Paul or myself by email so that we can share that with executive committee next week.
Yep, sounds good. So, at this point, I'll call for public comments. I don't believe we have any, but I want to make sure we give the opportunity. We do. Hearing none. Just really briefly, I want to thank Highlands College for hosting us here. Thank you, Jennifer, Sarah, for all the work. Crystal, you're part of that too, and team. These are lots of work goes into these meetings and really appreciate it. Thank you all for presenters. And Jennifer, I just so everybody knows, did a fantastic job at National Governor's Workforce Meeting.
Mention that.
Yeah, I'm going to mention it. This is worth mentioning. Adam talked about, we got to celebrate things like Dale's program. We got to celebrate this one. Jennifer presented Montana as the site for the summer NGA workforce meeting, and Montana Indeed and Billings will be the site. She did a fantastic job. Great graphics, good conversation, a lot of excitement. I would expect we have a pretty good showing.
Yeah, I think we're super excited. We will have all the workforce board chairs and policy advisors from all 50 states, hopefully here in Billings this summer with the governor speaking at it. So very, very excited. Huge shout out to the Department of Commerce who spent hours helping me with the presentation. Please let your team at Visit Montana know that their graphics and videos were so well received.
They had
Coming through again.
she had a, I don't know,
Rambo knew about that.
like a bear and a wolf, and we made it really clear, don't pet the critters when you come. But
It's great. I'm still thinking that some of our colleagues from other states are gonna be surprised. I still think they think they're going to the mountains, but we're gonna show them a really good time.
yeah,
They think they're going literally to the set of Yellowstone. Like there's going to be an adjustment period.
and then I will say, I'm gonna hold this till last, but thank you all for coming. We had some questions about a quorum. We blew the quorum away. Thank you all for attending online, and then on a Friday, everybody making the time to come to spend the time. Tremendous discussion. I mean, we limited out on every topic, and this could have been a really short meeting, but thanks to the great participation, we took all time but for 5 minutes. And last but not least, Dale, thank you so much for giving us the tour and spending the time with us at the JATC. Your passion for your industry and your career the last 35 years is infectious. I really appreciated you having the apprentices back there, because it really showed your how you've instilled not just your knowledge, but the love of sheet metal with those workers. So thank you again. And I will say that congratulations on retirement. We'll give you the last 35 minutes off. But well done. With that, we are adjourned.